Imagine sitting in a small spacecraft, surrounded by the vacuum of the universe. There are no windows you can open, no emergency exit, no nearby mountain to escape to if something goes wrong. Just metal, cables, screens, and absolute silence on the other side of the helmet. You're not there for a few hours like on a commercial flight, nor for a few days like on a short mission. You're there for years, maybe decades. For many, that is the dream, living among the stars. But in practice, it is almost a delayed death sentence. On Earth, breathing is so easy you don't even notice it. You walk, talk, run, sleep, and the air is simply there. The entire planet functions like a huge ecological machine that regulates itself. Oceans, forests, soils, air, and water currents recycle oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients for billions of years. This gigantic system works so that you can take a breath without thinking about anything else. In space, none of that exists. The vacuum gives you no mercy. Every breath, every sip of water, every bite of food depends on a chain of machines that must work almost perfectly 24 hours a day. Humans need 3 basic things to stay alive: air, water, and food. Said like that, it sounds almost ridiculously simple. But on a ship lost in deep space, each of those elements becomes a brutal engineering problem. Let's take water. On the International Space Station, about 90% of water is recycled. Sweat, urine, air humidity all pass through filters and processes that turn it back into something drinkable. It's a technological marvel. But that 10% loss does not disappear magically. It accumulates. On a 6-month mission, you can compensate by bringing an extra margin. On a multi-year mission to Mars, that margin becomes enormous. On a decades-long journey outside the solar system, it becomes directly impossible to sustain yourself with reserves alone. The same goes for air. Having oxygen tanks like it's a very long dive is not enough. It must be recycled. The carbon dioxide you exhale is toxic at high concentrations, so the ship needs systems to capture it and either transform or store it. Those systems have filters that saturate, pumps that wear out, sensors that lose calibration. Every component has a lifespan. Each one can fail. And if a key element fails, there's no spare atmosphere waiting around the corner. Then there's food. A crew in deep space cannot live forever on cans and freeze-dried packets without resupply. For long missions, sooner or later, you have to think about producing food on board, hydroponic crops, perhaps more advanced systems with algae, bacteria, and plants functioning as mini ecosystems. But this requires light, water, nutrients, strict control of temperature and humidity. A small misalignment in the system, a plant disease, an electrical failure in the growth module, and suddenly the entire food chain depends on a few emergency reserves. A greenhouse dying on Earth is an economic problem, but a greenhouse dying on a ship is the prelude to hunger. Behind all these systems beats a silent heart: energy. On the International Space Station, electricity mainly comes from giant solar panels that always see the sun in orbit. That source is relatively stable and predictable. But the farther you move from the sun, the more the energy you can obtain collapses. At Jupiter's distance, you receive barely a fraction of the light that reaches Earth's orbit. Beyond that, solar panels become almost useless. This forces consideration of nuclear reactors and other compact, long-lasting energy sources. It sounds like a definitive solution, but they also have a limit. They need fuel. When that fuel runs out, the ship stops producing energy. And when energy runs out, everything else stops: water recycling, oxygen generation, temperature control, the electronics that keep the ship alive. Then someone might say, fine, let's bring more water, more food, more fuel, more of everything. And that's when another relentless enemy appears: mass. Every kilogram you add to the ship has a huge cost. Launching things into space is extraordinarily expensive and requires ridiculous amounts of energy. The more mass you want to put into orbit, the bigger the rocket must be, the more fuel you need, and the more complex the mission becomes. It's a vicious circle. You bring more resources to survive longer, but in doing so you need more fuel, which adds even more mass, which requires even more fuel. There is no elegant way out of this loop with current technology. In addition, everything you bring has an expiration date. Food degrades over time, even in controlled conditions. Plastics, rubber seals, electronic boards, hatch seals, everything ages. On Earth, constant maintenance and part replacement is routine. In deep space, you cannot call a technician to bring a spare. What breaks stays broken, unless you have exactly planned a replacement. But every replacement is more mass, more volume, more complexity, impossible distances, and a universe full of bullets. When one looks at a map of the solar system, everything seems close and orderly. Drawn orbits, planets lined up, distances expressed in manageable numbers. In reality, these distances are so enormous that our current technology barely scratches the surface of what is possible. From the Earth to the Moon, a spacecraft takes about 3 days. That was already a monumental achievement in the 1960s. But the Moon is right next door, less than half a light second away. Mars, on the other hand, is several months of travel, depending on the relative positions of the two planets and the chosen trajectory. And that is still considered near. Beyond that, times begin to be measured in years, decades, and centuries. The fastest probes we have built would take tens of thousands of years to reach the nearest star after the Sun. It's not that we lack willpower. Physics limits us. To move a spacecraft with humans at much higher speeds, you need amounts of energy that grow rapidly as you approach a significant fraction of the speed of light. Each increase in speed requires more fuel, more propellant mass, more complexity. In addition, you not only have to accelerate the ship, you also have to slow down upon reaching your destination. It's like shooting an arrow at a distant target, but having to carry not just the bow and arrow, but also the energy needed to stop just before hitting the mark. The chemical rockets we use today operate near their practical limits. They are excellent for reaching orbit, getting to the Moon, or sending robots to other planets, but for interstellar travel with humans, they fall ridiculously short. Nuclear engines, fusion engines, giant solar sails pushed by lasers, and other equally ambitious ideas have been proposed. But all face the same basic realities: mass, energy, and time. Every additional kilometer per second comes at a high cost, and if you are planning a journey of decades or centuries, every mechanical or structural failure that today can be repaired in hours or days becomes a cumulative threat that can appear at any point along the route. To this is added a frequently forgotten fact. Space is not empty in the everyday sense of the word. There is extremely thin gas, dust grains, charged particles, small fragments of rock and ice moving along elliptical or chaotic orbits. Near the Earth, we already live with space debris, rocket remnants, defunct satellites, microscopic fragments. In deep space, there is not much human garbage, but there are natural materials moving at extremely high speeds. A ship traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour turns every dust particle the size of a grain of sand into a high-energy bullet. To protect themselves, ships can use special shielding, such as the so-called Whipple shields, multiple layers that cause a particle to disintegrate and disperse its energy before reaching the main hull. In theory, thicker frontal shields, ablative materials, or even clouds of your own particles to sweep the path can be placed. But all these methods have limitations. Shielding adds mass. More mass requires more fuel. More fuel takes up more space, complicates the design, and requires additional systems for handling. And even so, you can't shield everything forever. An impact with sufficient energy in the wrong place at the wrong time can pierce a tank, damage a radiator, break an antenna, or disable key parts of the life support system. Radiators are a critical example. A spacecraft in space has no air around it to cool its systems. Heat can only escape as infrared radiation through large surfaces exposed to the vacuum. These radiators are usually extended, relatively fragile structures. If a micrometeoroid punctures them, the ship's cooling capacity is reduced. With less cooling, systems begin to overheat, electronics degrade, and materials expand beyond their safe ranges. A single event like this, which on Earth could be solved with a repair and a spare part, becomes a turning point for the entire mission. Furthermore, long journeys require crossing zones of intense radiation, such as the belts of trapped particles around certain planets or regions where solar storms can strike without warning. A ship must navigate these hazards while also maintaining an efficient trajectory. The safest path cannot always be chosen. Often, the least deadly option must be selected. Every orbit, every correction maneuver consumes fuel, and every kilogram of fuel reserved for contingencies is a kilogram less for other vital functions. In this context, the word rescue loses its meaning. In low Earth orbit, if something goes wrong, there is at least the theoretical possibility of sending another ship within days or weeks. Billions of kilometers from Earth, that option simply does not exist. Whatever the emergency, the only real response is, the crew makes do with what they have, or they don't. Every system, from the most sophisticated to the most trivial, must be designed to function not only for years, but for decades, under constant radiation, occasional micrometeoroids, vibrations, thermal cycles, and natural material wear. This wear over time is treacherous. A cable that conducts electricity without problems today may develop microcracks over the years. A rubber seal that keeps a module airtight may become brittle due to radiation and temperature. A valve can jam due to microscopic deposits inside. On Earth, preventive and corrective maintenance relies on access. Open it, replace it, repair it. On a ship traveling far away, every spare must have been planned, packed, launched, and stored from the beginning. There are no last-minute shipments or improvised fixes with local hardware. If you didn't think of it before launch, you won't have it when you need it. The human body, designed for Earth, disassembled in the vacuum. The human body is an extraordinary machine, but it is a machine designed specifically for Earth. Everything in us assumes the existence of soil, an atmosphere, constant gravity, and a magnetic field that protects us. Taking that body out of its original ecosystem and sending it into deep space is not just a change of scenery. It is removing all the conditions for which it was calibrated over millions of years of evolution. On the Earth's surface, we live under a dense atmosphere that filters out a large portion of the radiation coming from the sun and the rest of the cosmos. Additionally, the planet's magnetic field deflects high-energy charged particles that would otherwise constantly bombard our tissues. In low orbit, such as on the International Space Station, astronauts already receive more radiation than on solid ground. But when the spacecraft leaves the protection of the magnetic field and ventures into deep space, the dose increases dramatically. Cosmic rays, high-energy particles, solar eruptions. All of this penetrates the hull, the equipment, and finally the cells. Ionizing radiation alters DNA. It breaks chains, generates mutations, and damages internal structures. The body has repair mechanisms, but they are not perfect. On short missions, the additional risk of cancer or neurological problems can be considered acceptable. On missions lasting years or decades, that accumulation of damage becomes a kind of biological roulette. Cells stop functioning properly, tissues degenerate prematurely, systems lose efficiency. It is not an immediate impact like a wound, but a silent wear that over time transforms a young and healthy organism into a fragile and vulnerable one. Shielding the crew is not simple. The spacecraft can be surrounded with water, hydrogen-rich plastics, or even layers of regolith if it is a base on the surface of a celestial body. But any serious shielding involves an enormous amount of mass. Every extra centimeter of protective material increases launch costs, requires reinforcing structures, and increases fuel consumption. There is no miracle material that blocks radiation without weight or volume. In practice, any reasonable spacecraft would end up being a kind of awkward compromise, some protection, but not enough to eliminate the problem. Humans inside would still absorb significant doses throughout the journey. Adding to radiation is another silent enemy, microgravity. When the body does not feel the constant downward pull of gravity, its entire support system begins to unlearn. Bones which on Earth constantly bear weight and stress stop being necessary to the same extent. The body interprets this lack of load as a signal to conserve energy and begins reabsorbing calcium. The result is an accelerated loss of bone density, similar to extreme osteoporosis. Even with intensive exercise and strict protocols, astronauts lose bone mass during prolonged stays. On a journey lasting several years, this process would make bones fragile, prone to fractures, and difficult to recover. Muscles follow a similar path. Without gravity, there is no need to stand, support oneself, or push one's own weight. The muscles of the legs, back, and torso, which work with every step on Earth, spend most of the time in space in rest mode. The body, efficient but ruthless, reduces the muscle mass it does not use. Although daily exercise can partially mitigate this effect, it does not eliminate it. After months in orbit, an astronaut needs help standing upon return. Their muscles are not prepared to support a 70 to 80 kilogram body under 1G again. On a decades-long mission, muscle deterioration would be difficult to reverse, especially if there is no possibility of returning to a normal gravity environment. Blood and other fluids are also distributed differently. Without a force pushing them toward the feet, bodily fluids tend to shift toward the upper part of the body. The result is a swollen face, a feeling of congestion, and increased pressure in the head. This shift is not just an inconvenience. It alters the pressure inside the skull and can affect the eyeball and optic nerve. In current missions, vision changes have already been documented. Some astronauts return with reduced visual acuity, sometimes permanently. In the context of a very long journey, these changes could accumulate to the point of seriously compromising the crew's ability to read screens, operate equipment, or perform delicate tasks. The heart also suffers. Accustomed to pumping against gravity, in microgravity, it relaxes. It does not need to work as hard to circulate blood, and over time, it remodels. This organ, like skeletal muscles, adapts to comfort and loses part of its strength. When a body so adapted to a weightless environment has to return to a gravitational field, the transition becomes a shock. Dizziness, fainting, inability to remain upright, cardiovascular risk. If there is never a return, the problem shifts to the moment when the crew tries to live stably on any world with gravity greater than what they have experienced for years. Fragile immune system, mind on the edge, and life in a metal can. On Earth, a cold is just an annoyance. On an interplanetary or interstellar journey, it can be the start of a chain of problems that is very difficult to stop. The human immune system is also calibrated for a specific environment: normal gravity, clear day-night cycles, constant exposure to an enormous variety of microorganisms. In deep space, all of that changes. Microgravity alters the way immune cells move and communicate. Studies with astronauts have shown that certain types of white blood cells become less effective, that inflammatory responses become deregulated, and that the body seems to lose some of its ability to react quickly and orderly to an infection. At the same time, viruses that the body had under control can reactivate under physical and psychological stress. Under normal conditions, these viruses remain latent, kept in check by a vigilant immune system. In space with weakened defenses, they can resurface and cause painful outbreaks or more serious complications. If this happens in low orbit, there are doctors on Earth, constant communication, and the possibility to bring the person back if the situation worsens. On a ship that is millions of kilometers away, the only resources available are a limited medical kit and maybe 1 or 2 crew members with general medical training. Modern medicine relies on something that does not exist in space: infrastructure, hospitals, laboratories, blood banks, specialists available for any complication. On a long mission, the medical inventory has to be planned in advance: antibiotics, painkillers, suture materials, basic equipment. You cannot carry a full operating room, nor have all the drugs that are considered essential today. An infection that can be treated in a couple of days on Earth can become dangerous if the right medication runs out, or if bacteria develop resistance. Appendicitis, pancreatitis, or a complicated fracture after years of bone density loss present scenarios that would require improvising surgeries in microgravity with minimal resources and no possibility of evacuation. Microgravity itself complicates medical interventions. Blood does not fall or collect in a container. It floats in drops that can contaminate surfaces and equipment. Stabilizing a patient, immobilizing limbs, maintaining a sterile field becomes a much more difficult task. On top of that, the crew, by definition, is small. If 2 people fall ill or are injured at the same time, the number of hands available to operate the ship and care for the affected is drastically reduced. In an environment where each member performs multiple critical functions, illness ceases to be an individual problem and becomes an operational threat. Overlaying this physiological strain is an equally critical factor: the human mind. The psyche is accustomed to a series of cues that we take for granted on Earth. The alternation of day and night regulates circadian rhythms. The presence of changing landscapes, natural sounds, interaction with many people, small daily movements, all of this feeds a sense of variation and motion. On a ship, Especially on a long-duration mission, the world is reduced to a few corridors, repeated walls, and the same faces day after day. There are no forests, no cities, no rain, no wind. You cannot go out for a walk to clear your head. The concept of the outside is limited to a lethal black void. Even on the International Space Station, where astronauts have windows with views of Earth and relatively short missions, sleep problems, irritability, acute stress episodes, and chronic fatigue have been recorded. Artificial lighting must be programmed to simulate day and night cycles, but rapid orbits cause the sun to rise and set multiple times per hour. The brain receives contradictory signals. The result is a persistent disruption of internal rhythms. It is hard to fall asleep, rest is not restorative, and concentration suffers. In deep space, without a blue planet spinning beneath your feet, this sense of unmooring would intensify. Outside, there is no visual reference for sunrise or sunset, only motionless stars and a uniform void. Social isolation adds another layer of tension. A small group living continuously in a confined space is the perfect ground for conflicts. Any personality trait that on Earth is diluted among hundreds of interactions is amplified on the ship. An annoying habit, a discrepancy in work style, cultural or character differences can, over the years, turn into chronic friction. There is no option to change social circles, see other friends, or take a few days away. Every decision, every task, is always shared with the same people. Even if the crew is carefully selected and trained, accumulated stress tends to erode group cohesion. Similar phenomena are already observed in extreme terrestrial environments. Claustrophobia, a sense of confinement, extreme boredom, depressive and anxious episodes. The difference is that in those cases, it is possible to evacuate someone if their emotional stability completely collapses. On a deep space mission, that option disappears. If a crew member enters a psychotic crisis, develops severe depression, or becomes aggressive, the only institution available is the ship itself. The crew is forced to manage the problem with minimal resources while continuing to rely on everyone's cooperation for survival. Colonies, generational ships, and the myth of becoming a space-faring species. The idea of space colonies and generational ships arises precisely as a response to all these limits. If we cannot make fast journeys, the apparent solution is to accept time as a given. To build self-sufficient habitats where multiple generations live and die during the voyage or in orbit around some distant body. On paper, it sounds like plausible science fiction, but when broken down into its physical, biological, and social components, it becomes clear that we are not talking about just a bigger rocket, but something much closer to attempting to replicate an entire planet in miniature and hoping it never fails. A generational ship is not simply a ship with more beds. It needs to be a closed ecosystem on multiple levels. It must produce breathable air, recycle water almost 100%, generate food in sufficient quantity and variety to avoid nutritional deficiencies for hundreds of people over decades or centuries. It must have waste management systems that do not collapse and reserves of materials to repair any broken element. Essentially, it must function as a stable artificial biosphere, something we haven't even perfectly achieved on Earth with much simpler experimental facilities and external contact as backup. Then there is the genetic and social problem. On a generational ship, the initial crew would not be the same as those who arrive at the destination. There would be births, deaths, families, generations who would never have set foot on Earth. Maintaining a population large enough to minimize inbreeding problems implies carrying hundreds or thousands of people on board. But every additional person means more resources, more space, more complexity. And even if genetic combinations were carefully managed, there would still be risks of hereditary diseases, radiation-favored mutations, and unpredictable changes in an isolated population over long periods. Socially, the mission also changes its nature. What was a clear goal for the first generation may become a distant abstraction or founding myth for the third or fourth. Those people would not have chosen the journey. They would have been born into it. Their known world would be the ship, not the final destination. Maintaining discipline, motivation, and a shared sense of purpose over centuries is something no human society has had to attempt under such extreme conditions. On Earth, Cultures change, mix, come into conflict, and transform, all with room to migrate, expand, or retreat. In a closed ship, any serious conflict has no escape valve. A theoretical alternative to mitigate some physical harm is artificial gravity through rotation. A ring or cylinder-shaped habitat that spins could generate a centrifugal force that mimics gravity and reduces bone and muscle loss. On paper, it is an elegant solution. In practice, building a structure of that size, capable of withstanding mechanical stresses for decades, protected against impacts and radiation, with integrated life support systems, and maintainable by a community with limited resources, is an immense challenge. Each rotating module adds potential failure points, moving joints, mechanisms that must operate flawlessly across generations. The same applies to radiation shielding. A stable colony, whether in orbit or en route between stars, would need much thicker protective layers than a fast transit ship. The use of water, ice, hydrogen-rich polymers, or even layers of regolith is discussed if the base is on the surface of the Moon or Mars. This protective mass could be used as a resource, but it still remains mass that must be placed and maintained in position. Transporting hundreds of thousands of tons of material, assembling it under extreme conditions, and ensuring it continues to function 50, 100, or 200 years from now is far beyond our current logistical capabilities. When these solutions prove insufficient, more radical proposals emerge. Cryogenics to shut down crew members during the journey, suspended animation, genetic modification to make humans more resistant to radiation, even cybernetic integration to reduce dependence on classical biology. They all share the same trait. They are much closer to speculation than applied engineering. There is currently no technology to keep humans in suspended animation for decades without irreversible damage. There is no safe, proven way to rewrite the human genome on a large scale to adapt it to a space environment without creating new problems. And even if progress were made in that direction, every deep modification opens a range of ethical and biological consequences we cannot control. But perhaps the most underestimated problem is the intrinsic fragility of closed ecosystems. Earth's biosphere has enormous redundancies. Millions of species, interconnected cycles, nutrient reserves, self-regulating mechanisms selected over eons. An artificial closed system, no matter how sophisticated, is a minimal and simplified version. A plague in crops, an imbalance in bacteria that process waste, a failure in ventilation systems or temperature controls can trigger a domino effect that cannot always be reversed in time. The longer such a system operates, the higher the probability that something will deviate from its stability range. All of this does not mean space exploration is doomed, but there is a vast difference between visiting space and living in it indefinitely.